On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards tried to vanish from Tenochtitlan. They moved through rain and darkness carrying weapons, wounded men, and as much stolen gold as they believed they could bear. Behind them stood the palace where they had held a ruler hostage. Ahead stretched a narrow causeway broken by open channels. Beneath them waited the black water of Lake Texcoco. Then the alarm sounded. War canoes closed around the causeway. Arrows and stones fell out of the darkness. Horses slipped. The portable bridge failed. Men carrying gold sank into the lake while survivors climbed across bodies trapped in the gaps. By dawn, the Mexica had done what the invaders claimed could not be done. They had driven Cortés from their capital. Tenochtitlan had won. But victory lasted only long enough for another enemy to arrive. One without armor, banners, or a human commander. Within months, smallpox would move through the city, killing warriors, leaders, healers, and families. It would weaken the defense before Cortés returned with a much larger indigenous coalition and a plan to destroy the capital through siege. The old conquest story calls the Spanish retreat the Night of Sorrows. But whose sorrow was it? To understand that night, we must return to the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, where a permitted festival became a massacre and an occupation finally lost the illusion of peace. By the spring of 1520, Moctezuma II had been held for months inside the palace complex, associated with his father, Toxcatl. He remained the Huey Tlatoani, the supreme speaker of the Mexica political system. Nobles still met him, commands still traveled in his name. Yet Spanish guards controlled access to his body, and Hernán Cortés used that captivity to restrain a city capable of overwhelming his expedition. The balance was unstable. The Spaniards and their indigenous allies occupied fortified quarters near the ceremonial center. Gold and sacred objects had been collected, separated, and prepared for division. Mexica leaders watched armed foreigners interfere with the ruler, religion, and wealth of the capital, while continuing to speak the language of friendship. Then Cortés received word that Panfilo de Narváez had landed on the Gulf Coast. Narváez had been sent by Diego Velázquez, governor of Cuba, to arrest Cortés and take command of the expedition. Cortés marched east with much of his Spanish force, defeated his rival, and persuaded many of Narváez's soldiers to join him. He left Pedro de Alvarado in Tenochtitlan with a small garrison, indigenous allies, the treasure, and the hostage ruler. The exact number of men under Alvarado is uncertain. What mattered was how they saw their position, a thin, armed line surrounded by a vast city whose patience was disappearing. At that moment, the Mexica prepared for Toxcatl, one of the major festivals of their ritual calendar. The observance was especially associated with Tezcatlipoca, although ceremonies in the capital also involved Huitzilopochtli. It included fasting, offerings, music, and carefully ordered dance. Mexica leaders asked permission to continue the celebration. Alvarado agreed, reportedly insisting that participants carry no weapons and that no human sacrifice take place. Later, the two sides remembered what followed in radically different ways. Spanish accounts claim that Alvarado learned of a conspiracy. Once the ceremony ended, the bridges would be raised and the garrison attacked. Indigenous narratives described unarmed celebrants wearing valuable ornaments while Spaniards watched from the edges of the courtyard. In those accounts, greed stood beside fear. The sources do not allow us to know exactly what Alvarado believed. He may have feared an uprising. He may have wanted the gold and jewels displayed by noble dancers. He may have transformed rumor into certainty because striking first felt safer than waiting. Whatever his reasoning, he chose massacre. The sacred precinct filled with musicians, priests, noble warriors, and young men dressed for ceremony. Drums established the rhythm, flutes sounded, singers answered one another. The dancers moved in ordered lines, wearing feathers, necklaces, lip ornaments, and decorated mantles. This was not a secret military formation. It was a public expression of Mexica identity, carried out with Spanish permission. The participants were largely unarmed. While the music continued, Spanish soldiers took positions at the entrances. The passages were blocked. No warning was delivered that the festival had been canceled. No attempt was made to arrest a small group of suspected conspirators. The attack came at close range. Steel swords and lances struck people who had no battle armor and little room to escape. Indigenous accounts remembered musicians cut down beside their instruments, dancers trying to climb the walls, and survivors hiding beneath bodies. The ordered circles collapsed. The sacred rhythm became panic. Some Spaniards may have stripped ornaments from the dead, but describing greed as the only motive would be too simple. The deeper horror is that fear and greed could reinforce each other. The more valuable the celebrants appeared, the easier it became for armed occupiers to imagine them as a threat whose destruction would also produce a reward. The number killed cannot be established with confidence. The result can. Tenochtitlan rose. News moved through canals, markets, compounds, and military houses. Mexica fighters converged on the Spanish quarters. Stones and missiles came from rooftops. Canoes maneuvered through the waterways. The causeways that had once welcomed the expedition became controlled approaches through hostile territory. Food and fresh water grew difficult to obtain. The garrison withdrew behind the walls of Toxcatl's palace, with Moctezuma still inside. Before Toxcatl, the ruler's presence had delayed a general attack. After the massacre, captivity destroyed what remained of that restraint. The political fiction was exposed. The strangers were not honored guests, and Moctezuma could no longer make the city behave as though they were. When Cortés returned from the coast, he brought hundreds of new Spaniards, absorbed from Narvaez's force. He may have imagined that his enlarged army and Moctezuma's authority would restore control. Instead, he entered an urban war. The Mexica allowed the column into the capital, then intensified the pressure. Bridges were removed. Attacks struck from streets, rooftops, and canoes. The men inside the palace had more soldiers than before, but they also had more mouths to feed and fewer safe routes out. Cortés attempted to use Moctezuma one final time. According to Spanish accounts, the ruler appeared above the crowd and urged his people to stop fighting. Stones and projectiles answered him. He was wounded, and the Spaniards later claimed that he refused treatment or food and died from those injuries. Indigenous traditions preserved a darker accusation. The Spaniards killed Moctezuma and other captive rulers when they were no longer useful. Some accounts speak of strangling or stabbing. Others describe bodies cast out from the Spanish quarters. The surviving evidence cannot tell us with certainty who delivered the fatal injury. What it tells us is that Moctezuma died in captivity, and each side had a reason to blame the other. For the Spaniards, death by stones transformed a hostage into a ruler rejected by his own people. For indigenous memory, death at Spanish hands completed the betrayal that began when armed guests seized their host. With Moctezuma gone, negotiation collapsed. His brother Cuitlahuac became a central leader of the resistance. The Spaniards were trapped inside a capital whose people no longer had to preserve the life of the captive ruler. By late June, Cortés decided that remaining meant destruction. The escape plan depended on darkness, speed, and a portable wooden bridge. The column would leave the palace, move west along the causeway toward Tlacopan, place the bridge across each break, then recover it for the next crossing. Cavalry and infantry would protect the line while the wounded, artillery, treasure, and indigenous allies moved through the center. Speed was essential. Gold made speed impossible. Before the retreat, portions of the accumulated treasure were assigned or made available to the soldiers. Accounts differ over how freely men could take it and how much was carried. They agree that treasure traveled with the column. Some men chose portable pieces. Others loaded themselves with metal whose value seemed greater than the danger of its weight. On the rainy night of June 30th, the expedition slipped from its quarters. For a short distance, the city did not react. Rain covered smaller sounds. The column reached the causeway and approached the first broken section. Then someone detected the movement. Later tradition placed a woman collecting water near the canal and credited her with raising the alarm. Whether one voice truly began the battle cannot be verified. What matters is how quickly the lake awakened. Conch shells sounded. Drums answered. Canoes moved from the darkness. Mexica fighters attacked the causeway from the water and from positions ahead. Arrows, darts, stones, and close-range weapons struck the packed column. Horses and men collided in the narrow space. The portable bridge became lodged at one opening and could not be recovered for the next. The retreat stopped being an organized movement and became a struggle over gaps filled with water. Artillery was abandoned, horses fell, soldiers tried to cross on beams, broken equipment, and bodies. Indigenous allies, too often erased from paintings of the event, died beside the Spaniards in enormous numbers. They had carried supplies, fought in the column, and shared the danger. Yet later European memory turned the catastrophe almost entirely into Spanish sorrow. The treasure became physical judgment. Men burdened by gold lost balance on wet stone or could not swim after falling into the lake. Some abandoned what they carried and survived. Others held on until the weight pulled them below the surface. The same metal that had justified months of coercion now reduced the chance of escape. Exact casualties remain disputed. Cortés minimized Spanish losses. Other accounts produced much higher totals. Modern scholarship generally concludes that hundreds of Spaniards and well over 1,000 indigenous allies were killed, captured, or disappeared during the fighting and retreat. The survivors finally reached the mainland at Tlacopan and continued west under attack. A famous legend says Cortés sat beneath an ahuehuete tree and wept over the ruin of his army. The image became inseparable from the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But the weeping tree belongs more securely to later memory than to verifiable evidence. The name itself reveals whose perspective dominated the record. For the Mexica, this was not a night of sorrow. It was a victory against occupiers who had seized their ruler, taken their wealth, violated the sacred precinct, and massacred people during a permitted festival. The city had broken the hostage strategy and expelled an enemy from its causeways. But victory did not create safety. Cortés and the survivors reached Tlaxcala, where the alliance endured despite the losses. He rebuilt his army, punished hostile communities, strengthened relationships with indigenous rivals of the Mexica, and began preparing vessels that could contest control of the lake. The war was changing from a dangerous occupation into a campaign of encirclement. Inside Tenochtitlan, Cuitlahuac organized defenses and prepared for the return he knew would come. Then, around September or October of 1520, not during the night of the Spanish escape, smallpox reached the capital. Chroniclers later traced the outbreak to a man often identified as Francisco de Eguía, an enslaved African who had traveled with Narvaez's expedition. That tradition must be handled carefully. It is impossible to reconstruct every chain of infection or hold one enslaved individual responsible for an epidemic created by transatlantic invasion, forced movement, and expanding networks of contact. The disease could travel through many bodies long before symptoms revealed it. Smallpox found a population with no previous history of exposure to the virus. It spread through densely connected households and neighborhoods, producing fever, pain, exhaustion, and widespread lesions. Indigenous accounts describe victims unable to move, obtain food, or care for one another. The epidemic did not distinguish between a warrior needed on the walls, a farmer needed in the fields, a porter moving supplies, or a leader holding an alliance together. Cuitlahuac died during the outbreak, only months after taking power. The loss was political as well as human. Command structures were disrupted. Families and military units were weakened. Food production and distribution suffered. Survivors faced grief while knowing that the coalition driven out in June was rebuilding beyond the mountains. Smallpox was not a secret weapon deliberately released by Cortés, nor did it conquer Tenochtitlan by itself. Describing the fall as biological fate removes the decisions and armies that followed. When Cortés returned in 1521, he came with tens of thousands of indigenous allies whose motives included survival, revenge, independence, and regional power. Brigantines attacked on the lake. Causeways were contested. Aqueducts and supply routes were cut. Hunger, thirst, disease, and continuous fighting reduced the capital district by district. The final defeat emerged from several forces acting together. Epidemic disease, the indigenous coalition, Spanish weapons and siege tactics, internal political fractures, famine, and the isolation of the city. Remove any one factor, and the outcome becomes less certain. Reduce the conquest to any single factor, and the history becomes false. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured, and organized resistance in Tenochtitlan ended. The Mexica imperial state fell. Its people and culture did not disappear. Survivors entered a colonial order built through violence, negotiation, adaptation, and resistance that continued long after Cortés declared victory. The darkest irony remains on the causeway. In June 1520, the Mexica defeated the invaders in direct battle. They proved that horses, steel, and gunpowder did not make the Spaniards invincible. Yet the victory could not close the roads created by the invasion. Soldiers retreated along them. Allies gathered along them. Disease traveled along them. The enemy expelled from the city returned with an army. The enemy no one could see was already changing who would be alive to meet it. Without the smallpox epidemic, could Tenochtitlan have survived the siege? Or had the larger indigenous coalition already made another war inevitable? Tell us which force you believe mattered most, but remember that history rarely kills an empire with only one blade. This is the history ledger, where every victory has a cost, and every silence in the record hides another survivor.